They laughed when Ethan Cole paid just $10 for a retired police dog that wouldn't even bark. But that first night, the dog didn't sleep. It stood frozen in the dark staring at one wall like something was breathing behind it. Every night at exactly 2:17 a.m. it returned to that same spot, until suddenly it started clawing, frantic, desperate, like time was running out. And when Ethan finally broke the wall open, he didn't find wires or pipes. He found something that shouldn't have been there, something connected to a case the department had buried years ago. And in that moment, he realized the dog wasn't broken. It was finishing a mission no one else survived to complete. And whatever Rex was trying to reveal, it wasn't over yet. Some things aren't bought. They're sent when you've lost everything else. The morning air over the County K-9 facility smelled faintly of dust and old metal, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down just enough for memories to settle in the corners. And Ethan Cole stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching as they lined up the retired dogs like forgotten equipment waiting to be cleared out, each one carrying years of service no one bothered to remember anymore. And at the far end of the line was the one they warned him about, a German Shepherd, named Rex, 6 years old, once one of the sharpest noses in the unit, now labeled unfit, unreliable, done, his coat still thick but dulled by something deeper than age. His amber eyes not restless like the others, but steady, almost too steady, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. And when Ethan stepped closer, one of the handlers shook his head with a quiet laugh, said the dog wasn't worth the paperwork, said $10 was already too much for something that wouldn't even respond to commands anymore. But Ethan didn't answer. He just crouched down slowly, boots scraping softly against the concrete floor, and for a moment neither man nor dog moved. The world outside fading into a dull hum of distant traffic and wind brushing against the chain-link fences, until Rex lifted his head just slightly, and their eyes met. And something in that silence felt familiar, not loud, not dramatic. Just a quiet recognition that didn't need explanation, like two survivors passing each other in the aftermath of a storm. And Ethan reached out his hand, not commanding, not testing, just offering it there in the space between them. And Rex didn't move right away, didn't wag his tail or bark or perform the way a trained dog should. He simply watched, and then, slowly, deliberately, he leaned forward just enough for his nose to brush against Ethan's fingers, a small gesture. Almost nothing at all, but it carried a weight that settled deep in Ethan's chest, the kind of weight that didn't come from logic or reason. And behind him someone muttered again that the dog was a lost cause, that it had stopped reacting weeks ago, stopped signaling, stopped caring. But Ethan stood up without a word, pulled a crumpled $10 bill from his wallet, and placed it on the metal desk like he was closing a deal no one else understood. And as they unlatched the gate, Rex stepped out without hesitation, not eager, not hesitant, just certain. And when they walked toward the parking lot together, the late afternoon light stretched long shadows across the pavement. And for a brief moment, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not hope exactly, but the quiet sense that maybe, just maybe, something unfinished had just found its way back to him. Though neither of them yet knew what it was, the drive home stretched longer than Ethan expected, the late sun dipping low over the highway as the sky turned a dull shade of amber. And beside him Rex sat upright in the passenger seat, not restless like most dogs in a moving truck, not pacing or whining, just still, his eyes fixed forward as if tracking something far beyond the road ahead. And every now and then his ears would twitch slightly, reacting to sounds too faint for Ethan to notice, the soft hum of tires on asphalt filling the silence between them like a quiet rhythm neither one of them felt the need to break. And when they finally pulled into the gravel driveway of Ethan's small house just outside town, the engine clicked as it cooled, and for a moment neither of them moved, as if both were measuring something unseen in the air, the kind of pause that only happens when two lives begin to shift in ways they cannot yet understand. And when Ethan opened the door, Rex stepped down slowly, his paws crunching against the gravel with a deliberate calm, not exploring wildly like a new dog might, but walking with quiet purpose, scanning the edges of the yard, the line of trees beyond the fence, the corners of the house where shadow gathered even in daylight. And Ethan watched him with a faint crease in his brow, noticing how the dog moved more like a partner than a pet, as if he had not been brought here to adapt, but to continue something already in motion, and inside the house the air carried the faint scent of old wood and coffee, a lived-in silence that had settled over the rooms for too long. And Rex paused just inside the doorway, his nose lifting slightly, drawing in the space, not with curiosity, but with focus, like he was searching for a signal buried beneath the ordinary. And Ethan set his keys down on the counter, glancing back at him, unsure what he expected to see, but unable to ignore the strange tension that seemed to follow the dog like a shadow. And the evening passed quietly at first, the sound of a kettle warming on the stove, the ticking of an old wall clock, and the soft shifting of Rex's paws as he moved through each room one by one. Not rushing, not distracted, but methodical, checking corners, pausing at doorways, standing still in places where nothing seemed different at all. And once, in the narrow hallway near the back of the house, he stopped. Completely, his body going rigid for just a second before relaxing again, as if something had brushed past his awareness and vanished before it could be understood. And Ethan noticed. Of course he noticed, because years of training had taught him to read small changes, to trust the things that did not make immediate sense. But he said nothing, choosing instead to watch, to let the silence reveal what it would in its own time. And by nightfall the house settled into that deep quiet that only comes when the world outside fades into darkness, the kind of quiet that can either bring peace or make old memories louder. And Ethan sat at the small kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, his eyes drifting occasionally toward Rex, who had chosen a spot near the living room wall, not lying down fully, not sleeping, just sitting with his head slightly lowered and his gaze fixed on a single point in the distance. And at first Ethan thought nothing of it. Dogs sometimes stare, sometimes drift into their own rhythms. But minutes passed, then more, and Rex did not move, not even when Ethan shifted in his chair or when the clock struck another hour. And something about that stillness began to press gently against the edges of Ethan's thoughts. Not fear, not concern, just a quiet awareness that something was not quite ordinary. And when he finally stood and walked closer, the floor creaking softly beneath his boots, Rex's ears flicked once, but his eyes did not leave the wall, and Ethan followed that gaze, studying the plain surface, the faded paint, the faint outline where a shelf had once hung years ago. Nothing unusual, nothing that should hold a dog's attention for so long, and yet the air around that spot felt heavier somehow, as if the silence there carried a different weight than the rest of the room. And Ethan exhaled slowly, running a hand along the back of his neck, telling himself it was nothing, just a habit the dog had picked up, just an echo of old training with no real purpose left behind it. But when he turned away and walked back toward the kitchen, he felt it again, that subtle shift in the atmosphere, like the house itself was listening. And behind him, Rex remained exactly where he was, unmoving, unwavering, waiting. And somewhere deep in Ethan's chest, a thought formed quietly, not loud enough to be called belief, but strong enough that it refused to disappear, that maybe this dog had not come here to rest, and maybe whatever it was watching had been waiting long before they arrived. The night deepened slowly, not with noise, but with the kind of silence that presses gently against the edges of a room until it begins to feel like something alive. And Ethan remained at the kitchen table long after the coffee had gone cold, his eyes drifting again and again toward the living room where Rex still sat, unmoving, as if time itself had paused around him. And there was something about the steadiness of that posture that unsettled him in a quiet way, not fear, not yet, but a recognition that this was not random, that whatever the dog was focused on carried a purpose too precise to ignore. And when the old clock on the wall ticked past another hour, Ethan finally stood, the floorboards whispering beneath his weight as he crossed the room once more, slower this time, more deliberate. And he stopped a few feet behind Rex, watching the line of his ears, the tension held just beneath the surface of his stillness. And then, without warning, Rex shifted, not dramatically, just enough to press one paw lightly against the base of the wall, a small movement, almost hesitant, but it carried intention. And Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, that same instinct he had learned years ago when reading signals no one else noticed. And he knelt down beside the dog, his hand hovering just above the spot where the paw rested. And for a moment he did not touch it, as if he were waiting for confirmation, waiting for the space itself to respond. And then he placed his palm flat against the surface. And at first there was nothing, just the cool texture of painted wood, solid and ordinary. But then, faintly, so faintly it could have been dismissed if he had not been listening for it. There was a subtle difference, not a sound exactly, not a vibration, just a hollow quality beneath the surface that did not belong to the rest of the wall. And Ethan drew his hand back slowly, his breath steady but deeper now, his mind already beginning to trace possibilities. And behind him the house remained quiet. But it was no longer the same quiet as before. It felt layered now, like something hidden beneath it had shifted ever so slightly. And Rex pulled his paw away and sat back again, his gaze lifting briefly to meet Ethan's. And in that moment there was something unmistakable there. Not confusion, not instinct alone, but recognition. As if the dog understood that the message had been received. And then he returned his attention to the wall, waiting again, patient in a way that suggested he had been waiting far longer than just this night. And Ethan exhaled slowly, rising to his feet, his eyes scanning the room, the edges of the ceiling, the faint seams where time had left its marks, and pieces began to fall into place. Not clearly, not fully, but enough to push him forward. And he moved to the small utility closet, pulling out a flashlight, the beam cutting a narrow path through the dim light of the room as he returned. And when he knelt again, the beam traced the surface more carefully, catching slight imperfections, a line that did not quite match the rest of the paneling. A subtle shift in texture that might have gone unnoticed for years, and Ethan's fingers followed that line, pressing gently, then firmer, testing the edges, and for a moment nothing happened, the wall holding its silence as if guarding whatever lay behind it. And then, just as he was about to pull back, Rex let out a low sound, not a bark, not a growl, but something softer, more urgent, and Ethan paused, listening, feeling the air settle around that single moment, and he pressed again, this time closer to where the line curved slightly near the floor, and there was a faint give, barely there, but enough, and he leaned back, his heart steady but alert now, the kind of focus that returned when purpose replaced uncertainty, and he stood, setting the flashlight on the floor so the beam continued to illuminate the space. And for a brief second he hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of awareness that whatever lay behind that wall had been hidden for a reason, and yet beside him Rex remained calm, unwavering, as if this moment was not a discovery, but a continuation, something already set in motion long before Ethan had ever stepped into this house. And that quiet certainty settled something inside him, and he reached forward again, fingers finding the edge, ready now to see what had been waiting, not just behind the wall, but perhaps behind the silence that had followed him for years. And as his hand pressed into the hidden seam, he realized with a quiet clarity that this was not about a house, or a dog, or even the past. It was about something unfinished, something that had found its way back, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan did not feel alone in the search. The pressure gave way with a soft, reluctant shift, not a loud break or sudden crack, but a quiet surrender, like something that had been holding its breath for years finally exhaling. And Ethan felt it through his fingertips before he saw it, the panel loosening just enough to reveal a narrow seam of darkness behind the wall, and for a moment he did not move, his hand still resting against the edge, his eyes adjusting to the subtle difference between shadow and space, while beside him Rex remained steady, his posture unchanged, as if this was exactly where they were meant to be. And slowly Ethan pulled the panel outward, the wood sliding free with a faint whisper that seemed louder than it should have been in the stillness of the room. And what opened before him was not a large hidden chamber or anything dramatic, but a narrow cavity between the studs, just wide enough to conceal something small, something intentional. And inside, resting carefully as if placed there with purpose, was a metal box, no larger than a shoebox, its surface worn but intact, the edges softened by time. And Ethan reached in, his movements measured, lifting it out with both hands as the faint scent of old metal and dust rose into the air. And for a second, he simply held it, feeling the weight of it, not heavy, but not empty either. And something about that balance made his chest tighten slightly, because it felt deliberate, like whatever was inside had been meant to last, meant to wait. And he set it down gently on the floor, the flashlight beam catching along its edges, revealing faint scratches, marks that hinted at movement. at handling, at a past that had not been entirely still, and Rex shifted then, just once, stepping closer, lowering his head toward the box but not touching it, his ears angled forward in quiet focus. And Ethan noticed how the dog's breathing slowed, how his entire presence seemed to settle into that moment, as if acknowledging something familiar, and Ethan crouched beside the box, his fingers brushing across the lid, searching for a latch, a seam, anything that would explain how to open it. And after a moment he found it, a small clasp along the front, simple, unassuming, and yet his hand paused there, hovering just above it, not out of fear, but out of respect for the unknown, because whatever lay inside had been hidden for a reason and revealing. It would change something, even if he did not yet know what. And he glanced briefly at Rex, who met his gaze with that same steady calm, that same quiet certainty. And in that exchange something settled inside Ethan, a decision made without words, and he pressed the clasp open, the soft click echoing gently in the room, and lifted the lid, slowly, carefully, as if time itself had stretched to make space for the moment. And inside was not money, not anything immediately valuable in the way most people would define it, but a collection of items arranged with care, a folded piece of cloth, a small notebook worn at the edges, and beneath them, something metallic that caught the light just enough to draw his attention. And Ethan reached for the notebook first, his fingers brushing against its cover, the material rough with age but still intact. And when he opened it, the pages inside revealed lines of handwriting, neat but firm, the kind that came from someone who understood precision. And Ethan felt a subtle shift in his breathing as he scanned the first few lines, recognizing the tone before he fully understood the words, because it was not just writing, it was a record, a log, something methodical, structured, intentional. And as he turned another page, the pieces began to align in a way that made the room feel smaller, more focused, as if the air itself was leaning in to listen, and Rex remained close, his presence unwavering, not impatient, not reactive, but present in a way that suggested this was never about the box alone. And Ethan paused, his thumb resting lightly against the edge of the page, his eyes lifting for just a second as he considered the weight of what he was holding, not just the object, but the story behind it, the time it had spent hidden, the reason it had been left behind. And he realized then, quietly, without drama, that this was not an accident, not something random left in a wall, but a message, something placed with the expectation that one day, someone would find it, someone who would understand what to do next. And as that thought settled in, he looked again at Rex, at the calm certainty in the dog's posture, and for the first time, the idea no longer felt strange that the dog had not simply led him here, but had been carrying this moment all along, waiting for the right place, the right time, the right person. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound barely more than a breath, and turned his attention back to the notebook, knowing with quiet clarity that whatever he read next would not just explain the past, but begin something that had been waiting far longer than either of them had realized. The pages felt heavier with every line Ethan read, not because of the paper itself, but because of the intention behind the words, each sentence written with a precision that suggested urgency without panic, control without comfort. And as his eyes moved across the ink, he began to understand that this was not simply a record of events, but a continuation of something that had never truly ended, the handwriting steady, deliberate, the kind that belonged to someone trained to observe, to document, to leave nothing uncertain. And the first entry spoke of locations, dates, times, measured down to the minute, patterns noted with care, subtle shifts in behavior, environmental details that most people would overlook. And Ethan felt a quiet familiarity in the structure, the way the information was laid out, because it mirrored the kind of reports he himself had written years ago, not identical, but close enough to stir something in his memory. And as he turned another page, a name appeared, written slightly darker than the rest, as if the writer had pressed harder against the paper, not out of emotion but out of emphasis. And beneath it, references to a unit, a designation that hinted at law enforcement but carried something more specialized beneath the surface. And Ethan's jaw tightened slightly as he read, not in tension, but in recognition that this was not a casual log left behind by chance. This was something official once, something that had been removed from its original place and hidden with purpose. and beside him Rex shifted just enough to settle. Closer, his body lowering to the floor, but his eyes never leaving the notebook, and Ethan noticed that the way the dog remained engaged not with the object, but with the process itself, as if he were following along in a way that went beyond instinct. And the next few pages revealed more references to a case, though the word itself was never used directly, instead described through observations, coded language that softened details without removing their meaning, locations that had been visited repeatedly, times that aligned too precisely to be coincidence. And Ethan felt that quiet pull again, the sense that this was not something finished, that whatever had been documented here had not reached its intended conclusion. And then he found it, a line that stood apart from the others, written slightly larger, spaced differently, as if it had been added after everything else. And it read simply, "If this is found, follow the pattern. Do not assume it has stopped." And Ethan exhaled slowly, his thumb resting against the edge of the page as his mind began to move, connecting pieces, not fully formed yet, but enough to shift his understanding. And he glanced briefly toward the wall where the box had been hidden, then back to Rex, whose ears flicked once at the movement, acknowledging without distraction, and Ethan turned another page. And this time the entries changed, not in structure but in tone, still precise, still controlled, but carrying a subtle weight beneath the words, references to a partner, not named, but described in ways that felt unmistakable, loyal, consistent, capable of detecting what others could not. And Ethan's gaze drifted slowly toward Rex again, the connection forming without needing confirmation. And he felt a quiet stillness settle in his chest, not shock, not disbelief, but a recognition that this dog had not simply been part of something. He had been central to it. And as that realization took hold, Ethan's attention returned to the notebook, his focus sharper now, more deliberate, and he continued reading, noting the way the entries began to narrow, the details becoming more specific, more targeted, as if the writer had been closing in on something, following a thread that led deeper with each step. And then, abruptly, the entries stopped, not gradually, not fading out, but ending in a single unfinished line. The sentence cut short as if time had intervened before it could be completed, and the space that followed felt heavier than anything written before it, because it carried absence, interruption, something left unresolved. And Ethan closed the notebook slowly, not because he was done, but because he needed a moment to let the silence return, to feel the weight of what he had just uncovered settle into place. And beside him Rex remained calm, his breathing steady, his presence unchanged, as if none of this was new to him, as if he had been waiting not for the discovery, but for what would come after it. And Ethan set the notebook down gently beside the box, his eyes lifting toward the room, toward the quiet space that no longer felt empty, but filled with something unseen, something waiting to be understood. And he realized then that this was not a story left behind. It was a path, one that had been paused, not ended, and now, without fully deciding to, he had stepped onto it. And the only question that remained was not whether he would follow it, but how far it was meant to go. The house felt different now, not in the way walls shift or floors settle, but in the way silence changes when it is no longer empty. And Ethan remained where he was for a long moment after closing the notebook, his hands resting loosely on his knees as he let the weight of what he had read settle into something steady, something usable. And across from him Rex had lowered himself fully to the floor, but he was not resting, not in the way a tired dog would. His head remained lifted just slightly, his eyes half-focused yet aware, as if he were listening to something beneath the quiet that still lingered in the room. And Ethan noticed how the dog did not look at the wall anymore, not the way he had before. And that shift alone told him more than anything written in the notebook, because it meant that part of the task was complete, one step finished. And without saying it aloud, Ethan understood that whatever came next would not be shown so easily. It would have to be followed. And he reached for the notebook again, opening it back to the pages that held the last clear entries, scanning them more carefully now, not reading for meaning alone but for pattern, for rhythm, for repetition, the kind of details that often hid direction in plain sight. And he began to notice something subtle, not obvious at first, but consistent enough to stand out once seen. The timestamps. They were not random. They repeated in intervals, spaced in a way that mirrored something structured, something intentional, and Ethan leaned back. Slightly, his eyes narrowing just a fraction as he let the numbers settle into his mind. Hours, minutes, sequences that aligned in a rhythm that felt almost mechanical, and then it clicked, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet alignment of understanding. Because the pattern was not about time itself, it was about location, about movement, about returning points, and he flipped back a few pages, tracing the entries again, mapping them mentally, seeing the way each note connected to the next like a path drawn across something unseen. And when he looked up again, his gaze instinctively moved toward the window, toward the darkness beyond the glass where the outline of the yard blurred into the tree line, and a thought formed, steady and certain, that whatever this had been, it had not been contained within the walls of the house. This had only been one point, one stop along something larger, and beside him Rex rose slowly to his feet, not abruptly, not reacting, but moving with quiet intention, and he stepped toward the door, pausing there just long enough to glance back at Ethan, not questioning, not waiting, simply acknowledging, and that single glance carried more clarity than anything else, because it removed doubt, and Ethan stood, the motion automatic now, his body falling into a rhythm he had not used in years but had never truly lost, and he reached for his jacket, pulling it on without breaking focus. His eyes still on the dog as Rex turned back toward the door, his posture aligned with something beyond instinct. And when Ethan opened the door, the night air moved in softly, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and distant pine, the kind of air that felt deeper than the space it filled. And Rex stepped out first, his paws quiet against the ground as he moved forward with a calm certainty, not rushing, not searching randomly, but following a line that only he seemed to understand. And Ethan followed a step behind, his senses sharpening as they adjusted to the darkness, the faint outline of the yard stretching ahead, the fence marking the edge of what was familiar, and beyond it the land sloping gently toward the trees, and Rex did not hesitate at the boundary. He moved toward the far corner of the yard where the fence met a narrow opening that Ethan had rarely used, a simple gate that led into a stretch of land that had remained untouched for as long as he had lived there. And when Rex reached it, he paused just long enough for Ethan to catch up, his body angled slightly toward the opening, his ears forward, and Ethan felt that same quiet certainty settle in his chest again, the sense that this was not a guess, not a possibility, but the next step, and he unlatched the gate, the metal clicking softly as it opened, and the sound seemed to fade quickly into the night as if absorbed by the space beyond, and Rex stepped through without hesitation, continuing forward along a faint path that only revealed itself once they were already on it, the ground uneven beneath their feet, scattered with leaves and small branches that shifted quietly with each step, and Ethan followed, his eyes adjusting, his awareness expanding to take in every detail, the spacing of the trees, the subtle dips in the ground, the way the air felt slightly cooler as they moved deeper, and after a few minutes Rex slowed, not stopping completely but reducing his pace just enough to signal a change, and Ethan mirrored it instinctively, his breathing steady, his focus narrowing, and then Rex stopped, his body still, his head turning slightly toward a point just ahead where the ground dipped into a shallow hollow, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, and Ethan stepped closer, his boots pressing into the earth with a soft weight, and he looked down, the darkness making it difficult to see clearly. But something about the shape of the ground felt wrong, not natural, not untouched, and as he knelt, brushing aside a thin layer of leaves with his hand, the soil beneath revealed a faint disturbance, subtle, old, but present, and Rex remained beside him, unmoving, his presence steady, and Ethan felt it then, the same quiet pull that had led him to the wall, the same sense that something had been placed here, not lost, not forgotten, but left, waiting, and he realized that whatever had begun inside the house had not ended there. It had only pointed outward, into something deeper, something that had been waiting beyond the edges of what he thought he knew. And as he looked up briefly at Rex, the dog met his gaze. Once more, calm, certain, and in that silent exchange, Ethan understood that this was only the beginning of what the dog had been trying to show him all along. The earth beneath Ethan's hand felt different from the rest of the ground. Not loose exactly, but layered in a way that suggested it had once been disturbed and then carefully returned to stillness. And as his fingers brushed aside the last of the dry leaves, a faint outline began to emerge, subtle but deliberate, a shape that did not belong to chance. And he paused there for a moment, his hand resting lightly against the soil as if listening through touch rather than sound. And beside him Rex remained perfectly still, his presence steady, not urging, not reacting, simply waiting. And Ethan understood then that whatever lay beneath this spot was not something to rush, not something to uncover without intention, and he shifted his weight slightly, reaching back to grab a small branch from the ground, using it to clear away more of the surface layer, each movement slow, controlled, revealing just enough at a time. And as the dirt gave way, a corner appeared, not wood, not stone, but metal, darkened by time yet unmistakable in its shape. And Ethan felt that quiet tightening in his chest again, not fear, but recognition. The same feeling that had come when he first saw the box hidden in the wall, the sense that this was part of the same thread, the same path. And he set the branch aside, using his hands now, brushing the soil back with more care, until the object beneath began to take form. A flat metal panel, slightly curved at the edges, embedded just beneath the surface as if meant to remain hidden unless someone knew exactly where to look. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the cool night air brushing against his face as he leaned closer, his fingers tracing along the edge until he found a small indentation, barely visible, but intentional. And he pressed against it gently, testing, and at first nothing happened, the panel holding its place as if locked by time itself. But then, with a soft shift, it moved, not opening fully, just enough to confirm that it was not fixed in place. And Ethan leaned back slightly, his mind already aligning with the pattern he had seen in the notebook. The repetition, the sequence, the way each step led to another. And he glanced briefly at Rex, who met his gaze with that same calm awareness, as if acknowledging that they had reached another point along the path. And Ethan returned his focus to the panel, adjusting his grip, pressing more firmly this time. And the metal gave way with a quiet sound, sliding just enough to reveal a narrow opening beneath. And from that opening came a faint rush of cooler air, subtle but distinct, carrying with it a scent that did not belong to the surface, something older, something enclosed. And Ethan felt his senses sharpen, his attention narrowing as he leaned closer, angling the flashlight downward into the space, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal what lay below. And it was not empty, not just soil or stone, but a cavity, small but structured, lined with the same precision he had seen in the hidden compartment inside the house. And within it rested another object, smaller than the first box, wrapped carefully in a layer of protective material that had held against time better than expected. And Ethan reached in slowly, his movements deliberate, lifting the object free with both hands, feeling the slight weight of it as the surrounding earth settled back into silence. And when he set it down on the ground beside him, the flashlight beam revealed more detail, the wrapping worn but intact, the edges folded with care, as if whoever had placed it there had intended for it to be found exactly like this. And Rex stepped closer then, lowering his head slightly, his nose hovering just above the object without touching it, his ears angled forward. And Ethan noticed how the dog's breathing remained steady, not tense, not reactive, just present, as if confirming rather than discovering. And Ethan crouched beside the object, his fingers moving to the edge of the wrapping, pausing there for just a second as he considered the pattern, the progression, the way each step had unfolded so far. And he realized that nothing about this had been random. Every detail, every placement, every layer had been part of something designed to be followed, not rushed, not skipped. And he carefully began to unfold the material, the soft sound of fabric shifting in the quiet night, carrying farther than it should have. And as the final layer fell away, the object beneath was revealed, a small device, compact, metallic, with markings that suggested purpose rather than decoration. And Ethan felt a subtle shift in his understanding, because this was no longer just a record, no longer just a message. This was something functional, something meant to be used. And as he studied it, turning it slightly in his hands to catch the light, he noticed a small detail along its side, a symbol, faint but clear enough to recognize, and something about it stirred a memory, not fully formed, but close enough to linger at the edge of his thoughts, and beside him Rex sat back again, his posture relaxed but attentive, as if the next step was not immediate, as if this moment was meant for understanding rather than action, and Ethan looked up briefly, the trees around them standing quiet against the night sky, the air still and watchful, and he realized that whatever this was leading to had not yet revealed itself fully, but it was getting closer, each step narrowing the distance between question and answer. And as he lowered his gaze back to the device in his hands, he understood that this path was not just about uncovering what had been hidden, it was about learning how to follow what had been left behind. And somewhere within that understanding, a quiet truth settled in place, that Rex had not been guiding him towards something new, but towards something that had been waiting for him all along. The device felt colder than the night air around them, not because of temperature alone, but because of what it represented, a piece of something deliberate, something placed with intention rather than forgotten by accident. And Ethan turned it slowly in his hands, the faint beam of the flashlight catching along its edges, revealing small details that had not been visible at first glance, subtle grooves, a seam that suggested it could open, and that symbol again, etched carefully into the metal as if it had been meant to endure time without fading. And he ran his thumb across it lightly, the texture worn but still defined, and something in his memory stirred just beneath the surface, not clear enough to name, but close enough to create a quiet tension in his chest. And beside him Rex shifted slightly, not stepping closer this time, but adjusting his stance so that he faced the same direction as Ethan, toward the object, toward the moment, as if aligning himself with whatever came next. And Ethan noticed that the way the dog did not push forward, did not signal urgency, but remained present in a way that suggested patience, as if this step required understanding more than action. And Ethan exhaled slowly, steadying his focus, and found the seam along the side of the device, his fingers pressing gently at first, then with more intention, and after a brief resistance, it gave, not snapping open but unfolding with a quiet precision, revealing the interior. And inside was not a screen or anything immediately recognizable, but a set of small components arranged with care, and at the center, a single narrow slot, and within it, something even smaller, a thin metallic strip, no larger than a finger, marked with a series of tiny engravings that caught the light in a way that suggested they were not random. And Ethan leaned closer, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the pattern, the arrangement of lines and symbols that seemed at first like decoration, but began to reveal structure the longer he looked. And he felt that same alignment again, the quiet click of understanding beginning to form, because this was not meant to be read in isolation. It was part of something larger, something that connected back to the notebook, to the timestamps, to the pattern that had guided him out here in the first place. And he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out the notebook, flipping it open with careful hands. And he scanned the earlier entries again, comparing the sequences, the intervals, the subtle repetitions. And then he saw it, not clearly at first, but enough to hold his attention, a matching rhythm between the markings on the strip and the way the entries had been structured. And his breath slowed slightly as the pieces began to settle into place, because this was not just a record, not just a guide, it was a key, and whatever it unlocked had not yet been revealed. And he glanced at Rex again, the dog's posture unchanged, his presence steady, as if he had been waiting for this exact realization. And Ethan closed the notebook slowly, his mind already moving ahead, tracing the path forward. And he stood, the movement quiet but decisive, and the night around them seemed to shift slightly, not in sound, but in presence, as if something unseen had taken notice of the step they had just completed. And Rex turned then, not back toward the house, but further along the tree line, his body angled toward a direction that Ethan had not yet considered. And for a moment Ethan remained still, the device still open in his hand, the metallic strip catching the faint light as he looked from it to the dog, and then out into the darkness beyond. And he understood, not through instruction, but through the same quiet certainty that had guided every step so far, that the path was continuing, that this was not the end of the sequence but a deeper layer of it. And he closed the device carefully, securing it before slipping it into his jacket, his hand lingering there for just a second, as if acknowledging the weight of it. And then he moved forward, following Rex as the dog began to walk again, Not fast, not urgent, but steady, purposeful, leading him deeper into the space beyond the familiar. And as they moved, the ground shifted slightly beneath their feet, the trees growing closer together, the air cooler, carrying a faint scent that felt older, less touched, and Ethan's senses sharpened further, every detail becoming clearer, the spacing of branches, the subtle dips in the earth, the quiet rhythm of their movement aligning with something he could not yet fully name. And after a few minutes, Rex slowed again, his steps becoming more measured, and then he stopped, his head lifting slightly as if listening, not to sound, but to something deeper, something that did not move through the air but through the space itself. And Ethan came to a stop beside him, his gaze following the direction of the dog's focus. And ahead, partially obscured by shadow and branches, there was something there, not immediately obvious, but present enough to draw the eye once it was noticed, a shape that did not belong to the natural lines of the forest, something placed, something waiting, and Ethan felt that same quiet pull once more, stronger now, clearer, and he took a slow step forward, knowing without needing to say it that whatever lay ahead was not just another piece of the path, it was something closer to the reason the path had been left behind. At all, the shape ahead revealed itself slowly as Ethan stepped closer, not emerging all at once, but unfolding through shadow and silence. A structure partially hidden by the surrounding trees, its outline softened by time, yet unmistakably placed by human hands. And as he moved forward, the ground beneath his boots shifted from uneven forest floor to something more compact, more deliberate, as if this area had once been cleared and then left to return to nature without fully losing its form. And Rex advanced just a few steps ahead, his pace steady, his body aligned with quiet purpose, not searching but returning. And when he stopped again, it was not abrupt, it was final, as if they had reached a point that had been marked long before either of them arrived. And Ethan followed his gaze, his eyes adjusting to the faint light filtering through the branches above. And there it was, a small structure, low to the ground, constructed of weathered wood reinforced with metal edges that had dulled with age, its surface covered partially by leaves and vines that had grown over it, as if trying to hide it without fully succeeding. And Ethan felt a subtle shift in his breathing as he approached, the air around the structure cooler, quieter, as if the space itself held something preserved within it. And he circled slightly to the side, taking in the details, the way the hinges were positioned, the placement of a small recessed panel near the front, and something about it felt familiar, not in appearance alone but in function, the kind of construction meant not just to store but to protect. And Rex moved closer then, lowering his head toward the base of the structure, his nose hovering just above the ground, tracing an invisible line that led directly to the recessed panel. And Ethan watched him, understanding now that this was not instinct guiding the dog, it was memory. And he stepped forward, kneeling beside the panel, brushing away the thin layer of debris that had settled over it, revealing a narrow slot, no wider than a finger. And immediately his mind returned to the metallic strip in his pocket, the alignment too precise to ignore, and he reached for it without hesitation, pulling the device from his jacket and opening it carefully, retrieving the strip and holding it for a moment in the faint light, feeling again that quiet weight of purpose in its design. And then he positioned it at the slot, his hand steady as he slid it into place, and for a second nothing happened, the silence stretching just long enough to test his certainty. And then there was a soft internal shift, a mechanism engaging somewhere within the structure, not loud, not mechanical in the way modern systems were, but deliberate, controlled, and the panel responded, easing outward slightly, releasing whatever had been holding it closed. And Ethan exhaled slowly, not in relief but in acknowledgement, and he set the device aside, his focus returning fully to the structure as he pulled the panel open, the hinges moving with a faint resistance that spoke of years without use. And inside was a compartment, deeper than the ones before, lined with the same careful precision. And within it rested a single object, larger than the box in the wall, more substantial, wrapped in protective material that had held against time with surprising strength. And Ethan reached in, lifting it out with both hands, the weight noticeable now, not heavy enough to strain but enough to ground the moment in something real. And he set it gently on the ground, the flashlight beam revealing the worn edges of the wrapping, the folds placed with intention, and Rex stepped closer once more, sitting beside him now, his posture calm, his gaze fixed not on the object itself, but on Ethan, as if this part required human understanding, not canine guidance. And Ethan paused, his hands resting lightly on the surface, feeling the texture beneath his fingers, and he understood that this was different from the earlier discoveries. Not just another step, but something closer to the center of whatever had been set in motion, and he began to unwrap it slowly, each layer revealing more of what lay beneath, until finally the object was exposed, and what he saw did not immediately resolve into meaning, but it carried presence, the kind that demanded attention, a container, solid, carefully sealed, marked with the same symbol he had seen before, only clearer now, more deliberate, and Ethan felt a quiet stillness settle around him, the forest itself seeming to hold its breath as he studied it, and he glanced briefly at Rex, who met his gaze with that same unwavering calm. And in that moment Ethan realized something that had been building with each step, that this path had not been left for just anyone. It had been left for someone who would follow it all the way through, someone who would not stop at the first answer. And as he returned his attention to the container, his hands moving to find the opening, he understood that whatever lay inside was not just the next piece of the puzzle, it was something that would change the way all the previous pieces fit together. And as the seal began to give beneath his touch, the quiet certainty that had guided him from the beginning deepened into something stronger, something that no longer felt like chance at all, but like a path that had been waiting specifically for him to walk it. The seal released with a quiet resistance, not breaking, but yielding, as if it had been waiting for the right hands rather than the right moment, and Ethan felt it through his fingers. Before the container fully opened, a subtle shift that carried more weight than the motion itself, and he paused there briefly, his breath steady, his focus narrowing to the space between what had been hidden and what was about to be revealed, while beside him Rex remained perfectly still, his presence grounded, his attention fixed not on the container but on Ethan, as if this part of the path belonged entirely to him. And slowly Ethan lifted the lid, the faint sound of metal moving against metal barely audible in the stillness of the forest, and inside, the contents were arranged with a precision that immediately set them apart from anything random or abandoned, everything placed with intention, everything preserved with care, and at the center rested a thick envelope, sealed but worn at the edges, its surface marked with the same symbol that had appeared again and again along the path, clearer here than anywhere else. And beneath it, partially visible, were additional items. A small stack of documents, a thin metallic object that reflected the light in sharp lines, and something else, something more personal, though not immediately defined. And Ethan reached for the envelope first, his fingers brushing across its surface, feeling the slight texture of paper that had aged but not deteriorated, and as he turned it over, he noticed a name written on the front, not printed, but handwritten, the ink slightly faded yet unmistakable in its clarity. And his hand stilled for just a moment, not because he did not recognize the name, but because he did, and the recognition did not come as a shock. It came as a quiet confirmation of something that had been building since the first moment Rex had looked at him, and Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound barely more than a breath, and he opened the envelope carefully, sliding out the contents with measured control, and inside was a letter, several pages long, written in the same steady handwriting he had seen in the notebook, but different in tone, less structured, more direct, and as his eyes moved across the first lines, the world around him seemed to soften, not disappear, but recede just enough to allow the words to take full shape. And the message was not coded, not hidden, it was clear, deliberate, and meant for him, not in a general sense, not left for anyone who might find it, but written with the expectation that he would be the one reading it. And Ethan felt that realization settle into place with a quiet certainty, not raising his heartbeat, not breaking his focus, but deepening it. And the letter spoke of the path he had just followed, not in detail, but in acknowledgement, referencing the steps without needing to explain them, as if the writer had known that the actions themselves would be enough to guide him. And then it shifted, the words moving beyond what had already happened and toward what remained, and Ethan read carefully, each line drawing him further into something that felt less like discovery and more like inheritance. not of objects, not of value in any traditional sense, but of responsibility, of continuation, and beside him Rex lowered his head slightly, resting it just above his paws, not tired, not disengaged, but settled, as if the final part of his task had been reached, and Ethan glanced at him. Briefly, that same quiet recognition passing between them, and he returned to the letter, his eyes moving steadily now, absorbing not just the meaning but the intent behind it, and when he reached the final page, his hand slowed slightly, not because he hesitated, but because he understood that whatever came next would not be written, it would be lived, and as he read the final lines, the air around him seemed to shift once more, not with sound, but with presence, as if the space itself acknowledged the completion of something long set in motion, and Ethan lowered the letter slowly, his gaze lifting from the page to the surrounding trees, the night no longer feeling empty, but filled with a quiet sense of purpose, and he understood then, fully and without doubt, that this had never been about finding something hidden. It had been about being led to something that was meant to continue, and as he folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the envelope, his movements calm, deliberate, he felt the last trace of uncertainty leave him, replaced by something steadier, something grounded, and when he looked at Rex again, the dog met his gaze with that same unwavering calm, and in that silent exchange, Ethan understood that the path had not ended here. It had simply changed direction, and whatever came next would no longer be guided step by step. It would be chosen, and that was what made it real. The forest seemed to breathe differently after the letter was folded away, not louder, not quieter, but aware, as if something that had been waiting had finally been acknowledged, and Ethan remained still for a moment, the envelope resting securely in his hand, his thoughts no longer scattered but aligned, not racing ahead, not questioning what had already happened, but settling into a clarity that felt unfamiliar in its steadiness. And beside him Rex shifted slightly, lifting his head and looking out into the trees, not searching now, not guiding, but simply present, as if his role had changed without needing to be announced, and Ethan noticed that the subtle difference in the dog's posture, the absence of that earlier tension, replaced now by something calmer, something complete, and he reached down, resting his hand gently against the side of Rex's neck, feeling the warmth beneath the fur, the steady rhythm of breath that grounded the moment in something real, something tangible, and for a brief second Ethan allowed himself to remain there, not moving forward, not analyzing, just existing in the quiet that no longer felt empty. And then he exhaled slowly and stood, his movements deliberate but unhurried, his gaze returning to the container and its remaining contents, because the letter had not been the only thing left behind, and whatever remained would not be separate from what he had just read. It would be part of the same message, the same continuation, and he knelt again, setting the envelope aside carefully before reaching into the container, his fingers brushing against the stack of documents beneath, lifting them out one at a time, the edges slightly worn but preserved well enough to remain intact, and as he flipped through them, he began to see a pattern emerge, not in the way the notebook had presented it, but in a broader sense, maps, coordinates, references to locations that extended beyond the small stretch of land he now stood on, each marked with the same symbol, each connected in a way that suggested a network rather than a single path, and Ethan felt a quiet understanding take shape, because this was not something confined to one place. It was something that had been built across multiple points, each one carrying part of the whole, and as he turned another page, he noticed something written along the margin, a short line, simple, direct, follow only what aligns, ignore what distracts, and he paused there, the words settling deeper than their simplicity suggested, because they echoed what he had already experienced, the difference between movement and direction, between action and purpose, and he glanced at Rex again, who remained still, watching, not intervening, and Ethan understood that the guidance he had followed so far had not been about being led blindly. It had been about learning how to recognize the path on his own, and he set the documents aside carefully, reaching next for the thin metallic object he had seen earlier, lifting it into the light, and as he turned it, he realized it was not a tool in the traditional sense, but a marker, something designed to identify rather than to operate, its surface engraved with the same symbol once more, and along The edge, a series of small notches that mirrored the pattern he had seen in the metallic strip, and Ethan felt that quiet connection deepen. The realization that every piece he had uncovered so far had been part of a system, not just of storage, but of recognition, of ensuring that the right person would not only find these things, but understand them. And he lowered the object slowly, placing it back into the container, his movements steady, his thoughts no longer searching for answers but beginning to form direction. And when he looked up again, the forest no longer felt like an unknown space. It felt like a starting point, a place where something had been handed over, not in words alone, but in action, in trust. And Rex rose then, not with urgency, but with quiet readiness, stepping closer to Ethan's side, his body aligned once more with the direction ahead. And Ethan met his gaze briefly, that same silent understanding passing between them. And in that moment, he realized something that had not been written in the letter, but had been present in every step, that this was never meant to be done alone, not in the beginning, and not now. And as he gathered the items carefully, securing them within the container before closing it again, he felt a shift inside himself, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but steady, a sense that whatever had been left unfinished had now found a place to continue. And when he stood, the weight of the container in his hands felt different, not just physical, but meaningful, and he turned toward the path they had taken to get here, the faint outline still visible beneath the trees. And without hesitation he began to walk, Rex moving beside him, not ahead, not behind, but with him. And the night seemed to open slightly as they moved, not revealing everything at once, but enough to show that the path did not end at the edge of the forest. It extended beyond, into something larger, something that had been waiting not just to be found, but to be carried forward. The path back felt shorter than before, not because the distance had changed, but because Ethan was no longer searching. He was carrying something now, not just in his hands but in his understanding, and each step through the trees felt steadier, more certain. The uneven ground no longer unfamiliar, but part of a direction that had already begun to take shape. And beside him Rex moved in quiet rhythm, not leading, not signaling, but present in a way that felt deeper than guidance, as if the space between them had shifted from instruction to partnership. And when they reached the edge of the yard, the open gate standing where they had left it, the house beyond no longer felt like the same place they had stepped out of hours earlier. It felt like a point of return, a place where something would now continue differently. And Ethan stepped through first this time, the container held securely against his side, his eyes already scanning the familiar lines of the structure, the windows reflecting faint light, the door slightly ajar as they had left it. And as he crossed the threshold, the air inside greeted him with that same quiet stillness. But it no longer felt empty. It felt layered, as if the space had been waiting for something to be brought back into it. And Rex followed closely, pausing just inside the doorway, his head lifting slightly as he took in the room, not searching now, not reacting, but acknowledging. And Ethan moved toward the table, setting the container down carefully, his hands lingering there for a moment as if grounding the object in its new place. And he opened it again, not with urgency, but with intention. The contents revealed once more under the soft light. The envelope, the documents, the marker, each piece now carrying a clearer meaning than before. And he reached for the maps again, spreading them out across the table, his fingers tracing the lines, the coordinates, the subtle connections between each marked point. And he began to see it fully now, not as separate locations, but as a pattern that extended outward, a structure that had been built across distance, each point reinforcing the others, each one waiting to be found in sequence. And Ethan leaned back slightly, his eyes moving from one map to the next, his mind no longer trying to understand what it meant, but beginning to recognize what it required. And beside him Rex settled onto the floor, his body relaxed but his eyes still attentive, following Ethan's movements with quiet awareness. And Ethan glanced down at him briefly, a faint shift in his expression, not quite a smile, not quite something else, but something softer than before. And he reached out, resting his hand against the dog's shoulder, feeling that steady presence that had brought him here, that had never faltered even when nothing made sense. And he understood then that the path ahead would not be the same as what had come before. It would not be guided step by step, There would be no more hidden panels or buried markers waiting to be revealed in the same way. Instead, there would be choices, decisions that would determine which direction the path would take. And that realization did not bring uncertainty. It brought clarity, because for the first time the responsibility was fully his, not placed upon him, not forced, but accepted. And he returned his focus to the table, gathering the documents with care, organizing them in a way that made sense to him, not just as information but as a plan. And as he worked, the quiet of the house shifted once more, not with sound, but with presence, as if the space itself had adjusted to what it now held. And when he finally stepped back, the table before him no longer looked like a collection of found objects. It looked like the beginning of something, and Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze lifting toward the window where the first hint of early morning light was beginning to touch the horizon, soft and pale, marking the end of one night and the start of something new. And he turned then, looking at Rex, who met his gaze with that same steady calm. And in that moment there was no need for signals, no need for direction, because whatever had been started had now moved beyond discovery. It had become something to be carried forward, and Ethan understood that the next step would not come from the past. It would come from him, and that was exactly how it was meant to be. Morning arrived quietly, not with sudden light, but with a gradual softening of the shadows, the pale gold of dawn slipping through the windows and settling across the table where the maps and documents still lay. And Ethan stood there for a long moment without moving, his hands resting lightly against the edge of the wood as he watched the light reveal the details he had studied through the night. The lines now clearer, the connections more defined. And yet what held his attention was not the information itself, it was the stillness that surrounded it, a kind of calm that only came when something uncertain had found its place. And behind him Rex stirred, the faint sound of his paws against the floor breaking the silence just enough to remind Ethan that he was not alone in this. And when he turned, the dog was already watching him, not waiting for instruction, not searching for direction, but present in a way that felt steady, grounded, as if whatever had been guiding them before had now settled into something quieter, something shared. And Ethan stepped away from the table, moving toward the window, the cool glass catching the edge of his reflection as he looked out across the yard, the trees beyond standing still in the early light, no longer shadows but shapes, defined and real. And he realized then that nothing out there had changed. The land was the same, the path was the same, but his understanding of it was different. And that difference was what mattered, because it meant the next step would not come from following, it would come from choosing. And he exhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled, the kind that comes when a decision has already been made even before it is spoken aloud. And behind him Rex moved closer, stopping just at his side, his body aligned with Ethan's without needing to be called. And for a moment they both stood there, looking out at the same horizon, the quiet stretching between them not as emptiness but as something full, something complete. And Ethan turned back toward the table, his movements deliberate now, gathering the documents with care, folding the maps along their natural lines, placing each piece back into the container in a way that reflected not just organization but intention. And when he reached the envelope, he paused for just a second, his fingers resting against it, as if acknowledging the weight of what it had carried. And then he placed it inside as well, closing the container firmly, not sealing it away, but securing it for what came next. And he lifted it, the weight familiar now, no longer something to question. And as he turned toward the door, Rex moved with him without hesitation, the rhythm between them already established. And when they stepped outside, the air felt different than it had the night before, not cooler or warmer, but clearer, as if the space itself had shifted to match the clarity of purpose that now guided them. And Ethan paused briefly at the edge of the yard, his eyes tracing the path that led into the trees, the place where everything had begun. And for a moment he simply stood there, not to reflect, not to reconsider, but to recognize that this was no longer where he needed to go. And he turned instead toward the road beyond the property, the open stretch that led away from the familiar and toward something unknown. And Rex followed, his steps steady, his posture calm, not looking back, not hesitating. And Ethan felt that same quiet certainty settle within him once more, not as a question, not as a possibility, but as something solid, something chosen, and as they moved forward together, the distance ahead no longer felt uncertain. It felt open, and somewhere within that openness there was a quiet understanding that what had been left unfinished was no longer waiting. It was moving again, carried not by what had been hidden, but by what had been found, and Ethan did not look back, because he no longer needed to. And beside him Rex walked with the same calm presence that had brought him this far, not as a guide now, but as something more enduring, something that did not need to lead in order to matter. And as the morning light stretched across the road ahead, the world felt wider than it had before, not because it had changed, but because he had, and whatever lay beyond that horizon was no longer something to uncover, it was something to become.